for joining us today for HCDLA's online seminar. I'm sorry we couldn't have it in person, but we're also planning on continuing with a free webinar at our normal monthly meeting May 7th, and we'll also have an interesting speaker there as well. I really only have 3 announcements for our members and those joining us. First, as you probably already know from the email, we made the decision as a board to go ahead and cancel our June annual meeting at Hotel Zaza, but we're going to roll that into an even bigger Clarence Darrow Award dinner, or event rather, in October, honoring Gary Bledsoe, our Clarence Darrow Award winner this year. In addition, we're also planning at least one other webinar on a member assistance for some of the voter registration and voter issues, likely towards the end of May. We now have the opportunity to hear from far West Texas and Alpine, Susan Hayes. Susan has a very interesting background before she became a cannabis lawyer expert. Practiced in Dallas, has done some mass torts, has done some asbestos stuff, and she did what a lot of us think about and made a decision that she was going to focus and become the Texas expert on cannabis law, and was directly involved in the drafting of the laws that she's going to visit about. What I think is also going to be very interesting is hearing her share with us the social justice implications of a regulated industry where thousands and tens of thousands of folks are still being charged with possession of something that has become legal across the nation in many states, and even Texas now recognizes certain benefits. With that, let me turn this over to Susan. And like I said at the beginning, if you missed, the way you're going to ask her questions is you look on the bottom of your screen, there's a chat function. You hit that, go ahead and hit it now if you haven't, and you'll see scrolling on there your questions. And that's where she'll have an opportunity to see your questions as it goes along, and we'll have time at the end to make sure she answers questions. So if you haven't already opened your chat function, please go ahead and do so. Thank you, Susan. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you. And I'm going to get my PowerPoint up here while I'm talking, and I apologize to y'all if the wind kicks up too much. I'm in the Airstream without AC, and the curtains may billow around me. But this is my law office for the pandemic, and it's actually pretty fun. I am going to fly through the first couple of sections of my talk because I'm a big believer as a lawyer. We really need to understand the substance of what we're working on. And what I have particularly found with issues around cannabis is people who are making policy and laws don't know squat about the plant or the science or the legal background. So, and then after that, I'll slow down a little bit as I go through these slides. And I'm going to be careful about my terminology. Cannabis is a scientific term for the plant. Hemp and marijuana are really arbitrary legal distinctions with this line in the sand of 0.3 delta 9 THC by dry weight. But in the popular language, hemp people think of as the industrial use, the fiber uses of the plant, where they use marijuana to mean things we use to get high. And that word was picked by policymakers to vilify Mexicans, because it was the influx of refugees from the Mexican Revolution, along with jazz musicians up to New Orleans, that really popularized or began to popularize marijuana use in the United States. All right, let's talk about the plant itself. It's a pretty amazing plant. It's not very closely related to anything except for hops, which is maybe one of my other favorite plants, and cackberries, which may be my least favorite tree. Y'all probably have heard of sativa indica. Those are the traditional subspecies of cannabis. It turns out they're not very good for that. The plant is dioecious, which means it has male and female plants. It also can change its gender if it's stressed. So when I first started working on this, I thought a transgender plant, boy, the Republicans are really going to hate this. It also has a whole lot of things in it. It's not just THC or CBD. It's also terpenes, dozens of other cannabinoids, flavonoids, and other things. A medical term you should be familiar with is the entourage effect. And this is the idea that if you take the whole plant in, those different cannabinoids and terpenes work together medically. And my evidence or example I use of this is Marinol. Synthetic THC has been on the market for years. It really isn't liked as much by patients as just simply smoking a joint. And the entourage effect explains why that is true. If any of y'all been in a dispensary in the West, you know, you go in and the dude at the dispensary will tell you that sativas are for a brain high and indicas are for a body high. But what I've learned hanging out with scientists and working in the industry is that's really just, to use a technical term, total bullshit. what's in the plant and what you're buying, you can't tell unless it's been tested. And in those dispensaries, what may be Blue Dream in one dispensary is not the same chemical makeup as Blue Dream in another dispensary. So those strain names really are meaningless medically. What's a better way of thinking about the plant is its genotypes or chemotypes. And what the science and the agriculture and botanist types are starting to speak in terms of is its type. Type 1 is a high THC, low CBD content. Type 2 is about a 1-to-1 ratio. If any of y'all are old school, Acapulco Gold is one of those. Type 3 is a CBD dominant and should be hemp, but you'll note I said hopefully because it does really depend on how it's tested. Type 4 is a CBG dominant or cannabigerol, and type 5 is your old school fiber, pure fiber hemp. For you science nerds out here, this is how the plant breaks it down. Whether it converts CBG to THC or CBD depends on whether enzymes are present, and whether those enzymes are present depends on the genetics of that particular variety of the plant. And once you oxidate THC, i.e. if it ages, if it's left out, it converts to CBN, which is a sedative. And this graph, I've been calling the graph that saved the hemp bill, because during session, the Lieutenant Governor's office became completely freaked out that if hemp grows hot, if its THC level's too high, people would be able to get high off of it. But because the genetics controls it, when it grows hot, you see the dots along the bottom. That THC level may go up a little, but it's not going to go up much. So that line at the bottom would be type 3. The 45-degree angle line is type 2, and the line along the x-axis is type 1 or high THC. All right, how many Texans smoke pot? A whole lot. From data that we have, at least 2.4 million adult Texans have used marijuana in the last year, 1.3 million in the last month. Nationally, CBD use is very common. I couldn't find any Texas-specific numbers, but about 14% of Americans have tried CBD. And then the Texas Compassionate Use Program, which is our medical marijuana program, it's so lame. It had less than 1,000 patients before 2019. Now it's barely over 1,000. And in a comprehensive medical cannabis law, that's about 3% of the population signs up. So in Texas, that would be well in excess of 1 million or so people. One thing patients and consumers should very much know is what they're buying. And right now for your CBD market, it's just the Wild West. Things are labeled and they may or may not be what people say they are. So unless there is full spectrum testing and reliable test results, people can end up losing their jobs because there's THC content in what they're purchasing. All right, some legal context, which I will now fly through as quickly as I can. Cannabis was widely used as medicine in the West until the early 20th century. And the little blip at the bottom is from an 1890 Lancet article from Queen Victoria's physician on the uses of Indian hemp. Very widespread. It wasn't until the early 20th century that began to be outlawed. First of any jurisdiction in the country was El Paso, and how that shows you how closely it was tied to the influx of Mexican refugees. Meanwhile, and what I want y'all to take away from this is all along, rule makers, policymakers, lawmakers have ignored the science. 1925, the US Army does a study and finds it's just fine and they were reacting to soldiers using it in the Panama Canal area. The bad guy in this whole story is the gentleman on the left, Harry Anslinger. He loses his job when Prohibition comes in. He's made head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and he is an over-the-top case up there with J. Edgar Hoover of bureaucrats aggrandizing power. He was also an avowed racist, as you see from his quotes about marijuana use. You know, he blamed it on Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, satanic music. And of course, they're going to turn it, throw the sexism in there as well, that marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others we can apparently get our hands on. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, additional penalties come in. One to really pay attention to is the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. That's created what is now known as Section 280E. You cannot deduct the cost of goods sold if you're a quote-unquote marijuana distributors. So you may think those dispensaries in Colorado are just raking it in. A lot of them are struggling because their federal taxes are so high. They can't deduct anything pretty much. In the 40s, the New York governor studies cannabis, comes to the same conclusion. It's a pretty good deal. The Boggs Act passes in 51. Anslinger gets marijuana thrown in with opioids and narcotics. Richard Nixon is our other bad guy in this story. He appoints a commission to study, and if y'all bear with me, I've now figured out how to add the chat so I can see it. Thank you. A commission to study it. They issue a huge report. It included an SMU law professor, by the way, that it carries minimal risk and is not a gateway drug. Nixon just ignores that and schedules marijuana as a Schedule I drug anyway. And then the money quote, in case we all thought this was a left-wing conspiracy that they were out to get us, gets us. John Ehrlichman in 1994, in an interview with Harper Magazine, flat out admitted it. They criminalized marijuana to go after their political enemies, hippies and black folk. And did they know they were lying? Absolutely, they did. All right, in the 70s, things start pulling back. Medical use emerges with what's called the NIDA Compassionate Use Program. And who knew, and I didn't know this until 2 months into session when I was doing some statutory research, Texas legalized medical marijuana research in 1979. It was so non-controversial on consent calendar, but it's never been used because the federal government has imposed so many hurdles to doing any kind of medical cannabis research. Our current status, we have kind of a detente because of what's known as the Cole Memorandum that came out under the Obama administration. The feds will not prosecute any state legal medical cannabis program. Jeff Sessions tried to undo that, but there's been a rider on the federal budget acts to prevent any money being spent to go after folks. And there's been some Ninth Circuit's decisions to reinforce this. So today, those budget riders are still in there, although every 6 months or a year, the cannabis industry kind of holds its breath to make sure it happens. And we also have what is now a patchwork of non-enforcement policies. Not only are prosecutors in places like Harris and Travis holding back on marijuana prosecution, I've also learned, I've been visiting with sheriffs in rural counties for clients, that even the Brewster County sheriff here on the border is not arresting or allowing even DPS to put in his jail low-level marijuana possession cases. All right, the Texas criminal laws, and the big takeaway here is edibles are outrageously overpunished. I made this chart to kind of give us a feel for how different quantities of marijuana, whether it's what we now call flower in the legit industry, or edibles or concentrates. Possession of mere flower, until you're get up to 4 ounces, you're at a misdemeanor. Delivery, and you can see the chart on there, will bring you larger amounts, even if you're just handing a friend a joint. You get a Class B. It's the concentrates that people are in big trouble. And concentrates can be a concentrated resin, which is known as like wax, butter, or shatter in the dispensaries, or it can also be the gummy bears. And I checked the weight of a teddy bear gummy. A teddy bear gummy is going to bring you a felony. A whole package of them can put you in jail for a long time. And there was a bill this last session to try to alleviate that by Representative Canales, and he couldn't even get a hearing with the Democrat as the chair of the committee. So watch for that issue to come back during session. All right, some collateral effects with marijuana. One, folks, I think don't necessarily realize is under federal law, possessing a gun and possessing a marijuana is a crime. So I spent some time in Nevada working with a cannabis company, and guys who worked in the company who had concealed handgun licenses would not buy legal marijuana. They were still buying on the street because they didn't want to have their ID swiped at the dispensary because of that federal law, for fear that the two databases would be compared. Other collateral effects are things you see with like parental custody, and also even insurance coverage. I found this statute preparing for this presentation that it's explicit that insurance policies don't have to cover any mental health if it, quote unquote, was caused by marijuana use. And I have no idea how that would be proved or shown. And then, as Mike alluded to, how many Texans are getting arrested for this? In fiscal year 2018, 68,000 misdemeanor marijuana possession cases. That's about 1/3 of the county court cases per year in Texas. Now, there was a precipitous drop last summer when the hemp bill passed. 14% drop for that whole fiscal year just because of the sharp drop in May and June. And then from May, and I'll credit Texas Tribune for this, to last November, the monthly number of cases dropped from 5,600 to about 1,900 per month. Now, question for us to all think about going forward is, some of y'all may have heard, and I'll come back to here in a moment, a lot of that happened because of testing capability. What happens when the criminal justice system ups their capability, and are the taxpayers going to be willing to pay for that? All right, the hemp laws. And some of y'all saw that press last summer of, oh my God, the legislature accidentally legalized weed, because the press loves to sensationalize this. People love to put pot leaves on everything when we talk about cannabis. My response to that is, you can take it up with Mitch McConnell, because that's why the federal farm bill passed, and that's why this happened. So into the Texas law, before the farm bill allowed some research programs under the 2014 farm bill for hemp. Texas never passed legislation to implement that. So 2018 farm bill was what helped bring this, prompted in Texas. That farm bill ended that pilot and research constraints. But what it also did that I completely didn't see coming was decriminalize other cannabinoids, not just hemp, but CBD, which was at the time becoming all the rage. And this is very fast growing, faddish industry. So now everything but THC that is derived from a cannabis plant whose THC level is below 0.3 is legal. And that's a total game changer. And it really shifted the ground under law enforcement. And I highlighted and read this definition of hemp from the statute, because you'll note it says delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, and that becomes very important later in the story. Both the state and the federal law, hemp laws, define hemp that way, and then the Controlled Substances Act exempt hemp from the definition of marijuana. All right, HB 1325 was the bill I was heavily involved in drafting and lobbying, and it was a pretty comprehensive, well thought out bill, and I'll love on a Republican for this. Senator Charles Perry from Lubbock did an excellent job, and his staff shepherding this through and thinking through how it could best help farmers, and when we spend a lot of time worrying about the poor truck driver. We don't even want to get arrested when they have hemp because the cop thinks it's marijuana. So under 1325, TDA will regulate the farming side and the processing side in terms of taking a crop and drying it and getting it packaged for delivery to the market or to a processor. Department of State Health Services, or DSHS, is going to regulate anything having to do with consumable hemp products. Under the Farm Bill and 1325, every crop must have a pre-harvest test to check its THC potency. It must be done by a third-party testing lab. And what's sort of interesting about that, that's obviously there to keep people from cheating. But under our medical cannabis law, that third-party testing requirement is not there. So in some ways, hemp is now regulated more strictly than medical cannabis in Texas. The bill did add a new crime to our books, and that is it's a third-degree felony to fake your lab test. All right, one completely goofy thing about the Farm Bill in 1325 is its poor use of the word negligent. A negligent violation, which sounds like you're doing something bad, really means you're pretty innocent. You didn't get your license, you didn't give them a good legal description of your land, or your crop grew hot, which can happen even if the farmer does everything right, because the plant does vary a little bit with growing conditions. And if you have 3 strikes, you're out of the program. 3 strikes in 5 years, you're out. Other violations, non-negligent violations, which sounds like they're not as bad, really means you're just flat out growing weed, and that must be reported to law enforcement. The USDA, and I've had a hard lesson in how much more aggressive federal agencies are in rulemaking than Texas agencies. Their interim final rules are just awful. They require crop destruction if your crop grows hot. The Texas law does not require that, and this was the one thing I was assigned to get into the law by a client, and was all proud of myself for doing it. And then the feds pull the rug out from underneath us, because it's very easy to extract excess THC and destroy it. You can take that hot crop, destroy the THC, document that, do a corrective action plan, and then the farmer can still make his or her money. USDA's killed that. And I think that's going to put a big damper on the industry in Texas, because it's an enormous risk for someone who's betting money on a good crop. They also put out some sampling and testing protocols that are just ridiculous. They require cutting the top foot or so of the plant. Well, that's going to weigh pounds. Imagine shipping pounds of a sample to a lab, whereas the standard in other states is 8 grams. They also require the samplers to carefully walk the crop back and forth, something that'll take an hour or so to do instead of a 5-minute stop to pick up a sample. You must test the total THC. Cannabis also has THCA in it. That's most of what it has in it. It only is when it is heated, it is turned into Delta 9. The type 1 and type 2 also have quite a bit of Delta 9 in it. But so by requiring total THC testing, they've made it a lot harder to pass. And Cornell University put out a study at the end of January demonstrating that by using that total THC standard, more than 50% of the type 3 genetics are going to fail. The regs also put in this measure of uncertainty, that if your testing margin of error, that is, if you're using a sloppier lab than a more precise one, includes 0.3, but your test is above 0.3, you don't get that strike. And but you still have to destroy your crop. So thanks a lot for that. And to make things even more confusing out there about the difference practically between hemp and marijuana, DPS is treating anything under 2% THC as quote unquote inconclusive. In other words, you're not opening yourself up to criminal liability for that. All right, police officer powers. This was the most heavily fought after provision in the bill. Lots of back and forth with the Lieutenant Governor's office on this. And I'm not making this up. At one point, the Lieutenant Governor wanted written into the law that if a drug dog alerts on a hemp shipment, it's probable cause to seize it as marijuana, because they did not understand THC has no scent and hemp and marijuana smell the same. And they also wanted checkpoints at our state borders for any shipments of hemp coming in from other states, because we've got that kind of resources in the state. So police officers may at any time inspect and collect samples to test, whether it's in the field or in a CBD shop. And however, and this was the save the poor truck driver provision, if a truck driver has proper documentation, the officer and proffers that to the cop, the officer must immediately release the driver in the shipment, unless they otherwise have probable cause to believe it's marijuana or a controlled substance. As far as CBD regulation, and this was another policy goal of 1325, because the FDA moves so slowly, it may take them years to regulate CBD. We wanted something in there quick, because we do know there are hucksters in the business. People who are selling olive oil of the CBD, or CBD with a bunch of THC in it, or CBD with other adulterants. I know that the Houston Crime Lab had tested some CBD that had K2 in it, a synthetic drug that's pretty dangerous. So dishes will regulate that. All CBD, once dishes gets their regs in place, which we hope to be by this summer, will have to have a batch ID and date and test results available to every consumer. The bill did prohibit, and this was something Patrick insisted on, the processing and manufacture of consumable hemp products for smoking or vaping, which kind of cracked me up at the time, because I thought, do they not understand it grows out of the ground and in a way it can be smoked? Like, you don't need to process it. The other goofy thing about that is it just means Texas hemp industry can just ship their product across the state line, process it or manufacture it, and then ship it back, because the Farm Bill requires that hemp shipments can cross state lines in interstate commerce. As far as the regulatory scheme, it's fairly light. TDA licenses the farmers. Dishes will just register retailers, and then they will license manufacturers. However, as the regs are coming out, I'm seeing TDA add every little nickel dime chance they get to add more fees. We have to pay a fee every time we get a shipping manifest. And that may add up to thousands of dollars for farmers, when in 1325, the licensing fee was capped at $100. All right, medical laws. Our program, is just to put a fine point on it, is awful. It was doomed from the beginning. It's not very useful medically, and it has very slowly evolved, and the Farm Bill has really put a knife in its heart. To begin with, and this passed in 2015, it's only for low THC cannabis, which is defined as 0.5%. And it initially had to have greater than 10% CBD. So it required a ratio of 20 to 1 or more of CBD to THC. And in cannabis medicine, that ratio is very important to the physicians. That's how they dose or do a prescription for a patient. It was only for quote unquote intractable epilepsy, which I didn't understand wasn't an actual medical diagnosis. It turns out it's something the legislature made up. And the way I learned that was with a family whose son has seizures and they won't mind me saying their name. It was former Dallas Cowboy Jay Novacek and his son had a seizure outside the Senate chamber while they were down lobbying for a better medical cannabis law. And I was with a physician who turned to me and said, "What's intractable epilepsy?" I don't know, I'm not a doctor. That's not a medical thing. It's not. And what we figured out is the Novaceks who've been trying to get their doctor to get their son into teacup couldn't do it because their doctor didn't think he had the right condition to get in, when in fact he did. And initially in the original law, you had to have not one, but 2 specialists recommended. And the regulation of it was given to DPS because, you know, it's health care. Of course, we should give it to our state police department. In the interim, in 2015 to 2019, it's really slowly developed the teacup program, and which is not uncommon in some states, but Texas has been, which will come as no surprise to any of you, pretty passive aggressive about it. DPS, to its credit, moved pretty quickly to do their part in the law. The governor's office interfered in 2016 and required them to put some pretty outrageous conditions in the regulations, including upping the application fee from a few $1,000s to 1.3 million. That later got lowered to a mere $500,000, but it's very expensive to get licensed. And they forced DPS to only give out 3 licenses, which may have turned out to be a good thing because the program has not attracted patients, and particularly because CBD has started flooding the market. And of those 3 licensees, only 1 is even fully operational, and they're bleeding money to the tune of $200,000 to $300,000 a month. 2019, there were 3 different medical cannabis bills, a very comprehensive one that I had a big hand in writing that was trying to pull the best ideas from other states, and then this very narrow expansion, HB 3703, which was what ultimately passed. It dropped that CBD floor, which allows different ratios, which is somewhat helpful. It dropped the second specialist requirement. It added an exclusive list of conditions, and this is a trap other states have fallen into, where the legislature practices medicine and picks who's allowed to come into the system. So now it's any epilepsy, seizure disorder, which is the Blake Novacek provision, MS, spasticity, Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS, autism, which happened because the autism mothers were such incredibly dedicated advocates and banged on doors at the Capitol until their knuckles bled, but it got them in the bill, where something like Tourette's didn't make the bill. Not just cancer, but terminal cancer, because this is the Compassionate Use Act, and then an incurable neurodegenerative disease. Now, DSH's got to make rules about what that means. And much to their credit, and to some pressure even from some conservative Republicans, they published a very lengthy list and allow physicians to petition to add conditions later. So now a whole slew of neurological conditions can get in, but they're still not going to get much THC in it if that's what that patient needs. And a lot of them do, particularly it turns out Tourette's. So as I said, 2703 did not raise the cap. Which isn't really helpful now that hemp at 0.3 is legal. So why would you bother going in teacup? What are you getting that's that different? They also didn't state the cap in a medically useful way. Doctors dose in milligrams, not percentages. They also, as I said, don't require third-party testing. And they also, despite some of the Republican rhetoric that we're only going to allow you to take this if the science really backs you up, well, where the science is strongest, if any of you go to PubMed, the National Institute of Health's database, and poke around, there's tons of research about how effective cannabis can be for pain. There's a little bit for autism, not a lot. Well, autism makes it, pain doesn't. Why? Because the Republicans were afraid a bunch of hippies would lie about hurting and go get high. And meanwhile, people who could really benefit from this aren't getting it. Something else to be aware of are the pharmaceutical cannabinoids. And this can be important when people are subject to urinalysis, whether in their job or because they're probationers. Marinol, you can see some of the others on the screen. Plant-derived cannabinoids, Epidiolex is the first plant-derived FDA-approved drug in this country. But the problem with these isolates is you lose the entourage effect. And so it doesn't really help. Some patients don't get the effects they would otherwise get if we had a full medical cannabis system in the state. And one other thing, I said, you worry about urinalysis with this, but what I'm seeing out there from talking to patients and their families is getting one of these prescription is in effect giving them cover because they have a reason why they're testing hot for THC. All right, I made this chart trying to figure out what's the federal attitude about cannabis, because people often freak out. Oh my God, it's illegal under federal law. How is you, a lawyer, can even talk to your clients about it? The feds are really schizophrenic about it. You know, USDA's fine, Treasury's kind of okay, you know, FDA is sort of okay. The Patent and Trade Office is completely schizophrenic. You can patent anything about cannabis, but it's extremely difficult to trademark it. There are publicly traded cannabis companies, so the SEC's fine with it. So it's a pretty complicated mess and a great opportunity for lawyers. Some ethics issues. I saw Mike had ethics on the list, so I squeezed had on the promotion, so I squeezed in a little bit here. And this really caused a lot of problem in states like California and Nevada who've legalized medical cannabis and then rec. People were really upset about the idea of how can you talk to your clients about something that's federally illegal. And looking at the Texas ethics rules, you know, we may not assist a client to engage in conduct we know to be criminal or fraudulent. You know, so there are limits on doing that, of course. And there's the crime fraud exception to the attorney-client privilege. We can't, you know, there is no privilege if we've enabled or aided someone to commit a crime or fraud. How does the industry deal with this? Bar associations across the country have issued opinions on it and pretty unanimously said it's okay for lawyers to help their clients comply with state legal cannabis programs. And I'll admit at first, the problem wasn't obvious to me because I thought, well, that's what lawyers do. We help our clients comply with the law. There are some other ethics opinions out there. Can judges in a medical legal state consume? Can they invest in a cannabis company? What about lawyers consuming or investing? And I've only found one negative ethics opinion, and that was, you know, not a fun state, North Dakota, where a Minnesota lawyer who was also licensed in North Dakota was under Minnesota's medical marijuana program. And the North Dakota bar, you know, North Dakota said no to that. And here's an example of a recent pretty comprehensive opinion out of New York. And what I found interesting about this is there was a great tone to it of, oh, come on, you know, the DOJ, even though the DOJ's the rescission of the Cole memos happened, doesn't really matter because we all know what direction this is going. All right, hot issues and what's next. And I think I've managed to leave us a good amount of time for questions, but I'll pop through some of these to give you an idea of what to expect going forward. And let me back up a little bit. Testing and consumer safety is a huge one, and it's one where Texas is not quite there yet. And while I hate the idea of the industry being over-regulated just because it's cannabis, it is a fast-growing industry, and with any fast-growing industry, there's shenanigans, and it's the government's job to clamp down on that. And then also the social justice issues. As I said, over 60,000 cases a year. Lots of folks in Texas have served time for marijuana possession and distribution. And now the plant is legal in other states. And if you look at who's making money, if you look at the boards of some of the bigger companies, it ain't a bunch of black and brown people on there. Famously, former US Speaker John Bonner has joined the board of a cannabis company after passing laws to criminalize people and, you know, continue to wage the war on drugs. And this issue last summer, as I saw, people flipped out in the media about this, and it really caught us who'd worked on the bill by surprise. And I will give Peter, who's the head of the Houston Crime Lab, some props. He was down at the Capitol desperately trying to get money for the crime labs because we grossly underfund them in the state. See all the rape kits lined up on the wall, you know, after 10 years of people trying to get that issue taken care of. He doesn't have enough toxicologists. He doesn't have enough equipment. I asked him during session, what would it cost to get you what you needed to have the equipment to test? And his answer to me at the time was $500,000 per 12 crime labs. I sort of did the math and wrote into the medical cannabis bill that did not pass that DPS could take some of that licensing money and give it to the crime labs as a way to fund them. It did not go in the hemp bill because I wasn't about to tax farmers for the failures of the state of Texas to fund our crime labs in the first place. Last summer, when all that press hit, the DA's Association was fanning the flames. But at the same time, and this did not make much press, even though the DA's lobbyist was who told me about it, and this is this case, Ex parte Saucedo. Mr. Saucedo got busted for methamphetamine in Harris County and pled out. And Harris County's policy, and I've talked to the second in command in Kim Ogg's office about this and got a lesson on it. Their policy has been to, when someone pled, to go ahead and send the controlled substance for testing. And when it comes to make sure it really was what they said it was. Well, in this case, it wasn't. It was another meth, something another, but not on the same schedule. Saucedo had another charge while out on probation, and that triggered a 10-year sentence. So this case was about the DA's office and his defense attorney asking that 10-year sentence be vacated, which the Court of Criminal Appeals did, but with a really warring discussion about whether substances should be tested before people go to jail for them, which my background is appellate law. That seems intuitive to me. How can you send someone, restrict their liberty for possession of a controlled substance when the government has not proved beyond a reasonable doubt what that substance is? Though we all know many jurisdictions have sent people to jail for marijuana because an arresting officer testified that in his experience, that's weed. And that was enough to imprison people. Testing issues, as I mentioned, these images I have here, this is what you get when you buy something in Nevada. You not only get THC and CBD levels, but even the terpene levels you can see on the right. And of course, I had to use Willie's Reserve as an example. Willie Nelson has a cannabis brand. Not only are there THC levels, but also the terpene level. Myrcene is a terpene that's also a sedative. Limonene, which is also in lemons, linalool, which is also in lavender, are present in cannabis. And there's a strong belief in the sort of the culture, and it's something of a belief in the medical cannabis, that those terpenes have medicinal effects, and they're a reason why different varieties affect us differently when we consume them. On the left is a chocolate bar, and often when you get edibles in other states, they don't have the terpenes because they're made just with the isolate. So you can see that here, where there's an equal amount, about an equal amount of THC and CBD. And fun fact, CBD counters the euphoric effects of THC. So something with some CBD in it is not going to make somebody as high as the other. Taxation, and I particularly bring this up because I understand that our Republican leadership is flipping out about the amount of revenue that's going to be needed to balance the state budget next session, not only because of coronavirus and the pandemic and the shutdown, but also because of the price of West Texas Intermediate. Nevada taxes a 15% excise tax on fair market value on wholesale sales from cultivators, and then a 10% sales tax for retail sales for recreational. If you have a medical card in Nevada, you don't have to pay that retail tax. They're collecting $8.6 million a month in tax revenue. Extrapolate that to Texas's population, you get $1 billion a year. And I'll go ahead and plow through these, and then I'll come back and ask questions. Licensing schemes. As Texas expands its medical cannabis and eventually goes to adult use, how that licensing is structured really affects who can get in. And this has been part of the social justice issues in other states. Right now, we're vertically integrated. It's one license for cultivation, processing, and retail. That's incredibly expensive to build out. You're looking at $1 to $5 million per tier of capital to get it up and operational at that level of sophistication that can meet the regulatory standards. Most states do tiered licensing. It's a separate license for cultivation, processing, and retail. And I'm a big believer in that because it's three very distinct skill sets. I think it is way too much for even the most capable of folks of a startup to do all three at once. And the more sophisticated states have independent third-party testing licenses, research licenses, so people can possess when they're doing research, whether it's medical or agricultural. And even with that third-party independent testing, Nevada, I was there for about 8 months. They had 8 licensed testers. They busted 2 of them for cheating in that time. And they cheated either to turn around tests quickly or to fake how high the THC was, because you can command a higher price on the open market there the higher THC is. So it's really important that the state be able to test the tester. Another issue you're going to see a fight over is home grows. A lot of states don't allow them, either out of conservatism or concern that those who are home growing will be using pesticides or things that aren't helpful for consumers. Other legal issues to watch out for: employment issues, as I mentioned, DTPA claims for defective and misleading CBD products. That's explicit in the hemp bill. Probable cause issues, not only for possession of flower, but what about paraphernalia? Because if people are smoking hemp, they're going to use the same kinds of paraphernalia. And you may think, what's the point of smoking hemp? But it's extraordinarily popular. Talking to some of these CBD retail shops who sell flower, including some of my clients, more than 50% of their revenue is coming from selling the flower. People like it because they get the relaxation or the anti-anxiety of the CBD without the high or the euphoria from the THC. And the other is, can a regulation go beyond the statute? And I particularly put this in there. Like you'll recall, Dan Patrick required a ban on the processing or manufacturing of hemp for smoking or vaping in the bill. Dishes hasn't formally published their draft rules. They did release an informal draft last fall that included a ban on the retail sale of hemp flower or hemp for smoking, which is not in the law and is a fabulous lawsuit to me with my appellate head on. That's just ridiculous. We don't do it that way in Texas. Some things to expect next session: push for comprehensive medical cannabis. I've been working with some clients and some companies on planning that campaign. A cleanup bill for hemp. There's going to be pressure to try to get rid of that ban on manufacturing or processing, and also get rid of just some sort of random silly regulations that TDA has put in and that may come from dishes. And now, and I wasn't optimistic about this a few months ago, but I think we may see a push for legalization sooner rather than later because of the potential for revenue. I'm going to leave that up while we do Q's and A's. Those are sites to my non-legal sources if any of y'all are science nerds like me. And let me see what we have with questions in here. All right, I've got, for those of you that are interested in getting involved in cannabis law, both commercial and social justice aspects, how would you suggest getting started? Learn as much as you can. And that's sort of where I started because I wanted to know what I was talking about. There's a very charming documentary on YouTube, if you Google The Scientist Cannabis, that's about an Israeli scientist who was the first guy to understand THC is what makes you get high in the 1960s. One of the first publications that CBD is helpful for seizures. And it gives you a good background on the medical. And then also there's a good ton of different email listservs. There's also some good publications. I subscribe to Marijuana Business. There's the MJ Biz conferences. Once as a society we could have conferences again, I'd recommend that. And there is also an International Cannabis Bar Association, which I highly recommend. I've been a member for a couple of years. The listserv is a great running in the background education for me. And just read because it's all new. There's very little that no one's OG cannabis lawyer except for some people in California. So it is a pretty interesting area and fairly easy to get into. Let's see what else we got in here. All right, regarding hemp growers, are licenses attached to the company or to the land? And the reason for the question is to see if there's a workaround for anomalous high THC test on a crop by breaking the crop into multiple fields. That way the grower could possibly hedge their bets and potentially only have to destroy the crop from one of several fields. I'll break into that of how it works. It is attached to the company and not the land. So as a company or as an individual, you file for your grower's license. That licensing opened up 2 weeks ago, Monday on March 16th. They're supposed to start issuing licenses yesterday. I filed 3 on the first day and I haven't seen any yet. But then we have to buy a permit for everything. Every lot, and a lot is defined as a contiguous growing area of the same variety of hemp, has to have a permit. And every lot must be tested individually. So let's say I have 10 acres and I want to try 4 different varieties to see how they grow in my climate. And that's something farmers are going to want to do because we have no known tested varieties for hemp in Texas climates. It is a very photosensitive plant. The length of the day triggers flowering. So a variety that grows well in a high latitude like Oregon may fail miserably in Texas because it tumbles over once it starts flowering because it hasn't vegetated enough. So I may want to do that, but if one of my 4 grow hot, yay, I only have to destroy that lot. But what if 3 of them grow hot in 1 year? Is that 3 strikes and I'm out, or is it only 1 strike? And I have asked TDA that question and not gotten a clear answer. If I'm a business person or a farmer and I want to try hemp on different properties, it would behoove you to set up different companies to then apply for the licenses, even though the same ownership's behind the scenes. As I understand the current regulatory regime, that works. And to the extent that I've advised clients to do the same. Yes, I'm happy to download my presentation. And next question, what about hashish, keef, and other imported not farm-grown cannabis products? When I say the word keef, I understand that to mean the shake that happens when you touch or process cannabis flowers. Cannabis flowers, the cannabinoids are concentrated in the flower. That's when you only grow female plants. And when people are trimming it, the keef falls out, and it's incredibly valuable in legal rec states. Like a quart mason jar full of keef is worth several $1,000s because it's so concentrated THC. Import, right now, there are no imports that are legal into the United States of anything that is, quote, marijuana as opposed to hemp. It's still going to be illegal here. The import-export issues are, I mean, that's the A+ class cannabis lawyering, because it is so complicated. It is country by country, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Colombia, of all predictable places, is really leaping ahead in the Latin American markets as setting up itself to be able to export cannabis, as that's allowed to other countries. Do we have any other questions out there? And if I missed one, I'm scrolling back through this chat to make sure. I don't believe I have.
Susan, there is one from, oh, it has to do, we should be able to load your course materials onto the Harris County Democratic Lawyer webpage.
Yep, absolutely.
On that. We're going to go ahead and leave it up. If I can ask Carol to go ahead and put up the course number. I've also placed it, as well as the link to report your hours online to the State Bar. Course number's up there on the screen right now. It's also in the chat. We're going to hopefully make the video available as well, so that you can, if there's anything in particular that you want to check on. Our plan, and Steve Dubois, our Vice President, confirmed for me, our May 7th speaker, or speakers rather, will be Diane Troutman, who'll be talking about the voter issues that we encountered in the early primary, and what's going to happen, not just about fixing the problem in Harris County, but also what's a hot topic, vote by mail. The ACLU has just today intervened in a case pending in Travis County to require the state to allow everyone to vote by mail, given the coronavirus implications, and basically expand the idea of disability as well. And then we'll also plan, like I said, doing another event, likely end of May, beginning of June, which will probably be another online CLE. Our hope is, see how things shake out, is that we might potentially be able to have a June event, not the all year, or not the annual meeting, but some other kind of CLE event that'll be free to members. And it's our intent for the May 7th online with Diane Troutman and the Texas Democratic Party Voter Protection Chair, those 2 speakers, to also make that free to members and non-members alike. Susan, I don't think we have any additional questions.
We had one more come in.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And that is there a cartel or public safety impact to legalizing marijuana? And this is, of course, one of the fears that comes up from those who are opposed. What's happened in California, and mind you, California has a long history of growing cannabis underground, and a lot of it on public lands. Starting about 10 or 15 years ago, cartels started moving into California to do grows. So there absolutely is some cartel activity there, but that predated legalization. And where the federal enforcement efforts are concentrating in California are not on the state licensees for even adult use, but on trying to eliminate that cartel activity. And it's not only dangerous because of cartel activity. Playboy magazine, of all places, had a very interesting article about their use of incredibly dangerous pesticides, which they're purposely using because they know law enforcement then becomes afraid to raid the grows. And then they're selling that stuff into the black market, into other states. Mind you, California produces about 5 times more marijuana than they can possibly consume. And that's what people get on the black market in non-legal states.
Well, Susan, thank you very much. And actually, you've also done what we're always encouraged is hit the button almost exactly on timing. So good job on planning your PowerPoint. Is there anything else that you think that you'd like to share that you haven't already visited with our members and the folks that have been able to join us today?
I see a question from my buddy Terry O'Rourke about Democratic candidates to say. I'll say this about where I see cannabis regulation. Excuse me. Sorry, I got it. I swear that's West Texas air and not coronavirus.
You're making my throat talk too. Take your time.
Sorry about that. All right.
No, take your time. If you want to take a break, that's okay.
Take another drink of water.
I'd also ask that if you enjoyed the way this worked, or if you have any suggestions for the presentation, just in terms of the technology, obviously this is something that I wish I'd had stock in Zoom, having used it 7 years, but I wish I had stock in Zoom in January. But it certainly seems to work well. Are you ready, Susan? No, not yet.
Right.
But practicality, if there's suggestions you have for our board, please go ahead and share it with us. Go ahead, Susan.
Will do, and I apologize. Those of you who know me, I actually do this a lot. It's like a weird asthmatic reaction I have. But for candidates, I've seen the polling on this in Texas. Medical cannabis is extremely popular. Even conservative Republicans want it expanded. Conservative religious Republicans. So it is a great campaign issue that appeals to the middle. Legalization in Texas is tipping above 50%. Also a good issue. So some of the talking points I give them is talk about how absurd it is people go to jail for it. Talk about how is it that we've let little kids suffer because we've not let them have access to the medicine. And I particularly think of, there's a rancher in East Texas whose daughter has Tourette's. And one thing I learned lobbying on this is we have a lot of underground buyers clubs for families with kids with really severe conditions. It helps them, and they shouldn't be criminalized. And I'm a firm believer that a lot of the recreational users are really medical users. I got a chance to see MJ Hagar speak in a small group, and I asked her position on cannabis, and she had the best answer I've heard. She says she will advocate for legalizing because she knows a lot of veterans will not admit they have mental health issues, and that cannabis can help them with PTSD and anxiety and other stressors. And unless it's fully legal, they're not going to get that help, which I thought was absolutely the best answer I've heard. Another overarching message for Democrats: our policies should be science-driven, and they're not under the Republicans. And we're seeing that play out in the pandemic and how much it's hurting us. And if we have science-driven policies, then cannabis should be legal and it should be available medicinally as well.
Thank you, Susan. And also, I don't want to leave out Harold Mullins with Riverside Media, who's been our Zoom expert for the last 8 years. Thank you for running this so well. And thank you, and hope you feel better, Susan. That was a very interesting, I've already seen great comments. But like I said, go ahead, and if you have any suggestions for the board of either things we can do virtually or that would be helpful here locally, there is some consideration about the voter means and mail, and making sure that that's available, because that's going to be really important for our voters in the next foreseeable future. So thank you for joining us, and we appreciate you taking the time to log in. We'll see you on May 7th. In any questions at all, any suggestions, any comments, you're welcome to send them in to president@hcdla.com. We'll see you next month, and thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Glad to do it.
Thanks, Susan. And like I said, please make sure you go ahead and log on to